My name is Larken Rose, and I sort of accidentally became a voluntarist 23 years ago, almost 24 now, just by enjoying debating, but not enjoying it when I felt like my own position was not really entirely consistent. And so with debating other people about politics, and I was sort of, right-leaning, conservative, constitutionalist, whatever you want to call it, and I would argue against mostly the political left and how it's not okay to steal my money to give it to the poor. Like, I can voluntarily give it to the poor, that's actual charity, but don't rob me for it. But I still believed in having government tax people for the military and police and stuff. But the more I debated and the more I wanted to be consistent in my position, I realized, well, how can I say, you're not allowed to tax me for whatever you think is important, but for some reason I'm allowed to tax you for whatever I think is important. And so I sort of accidentally fell off the political spectrum by basically whittling away at what I thought was legitimate government. Like, government should only do A, B, and C, and then figuring out, well, it shouldn't do C. It should only do, and well, it shouldn't do B. And, well, it shouldn't exist. And I basically logicked myself into the fact that political authority is an impossibility. To me, it wasn't about what works and what doesn't. It's that you cannot have the right to rule and you cannot have an obligation to obey a ruler above your own conscience. So I sort of accidentally figured out that, oops, that kind of makes me an anarchist, because it means I believe in cooperation, I believe in organization, I believe in a whole bunch of different ways of people getting along, but violent coercion isn't one of them. And violent coercion is what government inherently is. So I kind of figured out I have to be against government. I really am anti-government. Lots of people get that label thrown at them. I proudly wear that because government is anti-human. The worst tyrannies in history have been democratically elected constitutional republics. That includes Red China and the Soviet Union. And I wasn't taught that growing up, but if you look at their constitutions, they allow their people to vote, and they say, we're representing you. And the reason it's so much worse, I mean, you can say, well, that's not real democracy, and it isn't, it's a sham. But the reason I think it's actually worse than a monarch is because a monarch doesn't even pretend that he's serving you. It's just like, I'm your boss, I do what I want. Whereas tyrannies that can pretend they're representing the people can get away with more, because they can tell you, first of all, we have your consent, you voted for us, or at least some of you voted for us, or something kind of like that. And in a few more years, if you don't like us stomping on you, you can vote for somebody else. Giving people the appearance that they can influence the system actually enables ruling classes to be more vicious than if they're just saying, we're ruling you because we can. Because people will more quickly say, well, then we're just going to have a revolution if you just say, I'm going to do whatever I want to you, than if they say, well, you can vote, you can participate in the process, you can do all that. You have avenues of recourse if you don't like it when we have a democracy. And the truth is, no, you don't, but they give you a way to waste your time and effort with the illusion that you have some influence. And as long as people have that illusion, they actually put up with worse tyrannies. Like I said, look it up. Look up the constitutions of the Soviet Union and Communist China and the Weimar Republic, which turned into Nazi Germany. They're all democratically elected constitutional republics, and they all killed more people than any monarchy or direct oligarchy admitting it's an oligarchy ever did.
So it's like the idea of if I'm an old school slave in the South, I've got a shackle on my ankle, I know exactly what's going on. I know who the fucking person is, but yeah, that shackle's on us now, we don't know it.
It's funny you use that example because I made a video called The Jones Plantation, which anybody can look up on YouTube, and it's exactly that. It's about, and it's a little animated thing, about a slave master saying, my slaves are getting uppity and trying to run away, and somebody says, I know how to help. And he basically introduces democracy, where now we're going to let the slaves choose between two masters. Either way, you're still a slave, we're going to force you to work, but giving them that illusion will let you get away with more. So it's funny you brought up that example, because I've made a video exactly about that called the Jones Plantation. And a bunch of people watched it and were like, ooh, that's kind of horrible awakening of that's what we're in. And it's actually worse than somebody just saying, well, I'm big and bad and you'll do what I want or I hurt you. They get away with more if they can pretend they're representing you.
You are no longer the property of Mr. Jones, Mr. Smith continued. You are free. No more would you be forced to labor for the benefit of Mr. Jones. Now you can work for yourselves. Now the slaves were all murmuring and looking at each other. Many were smiling, many were looking puzzled. In fact, you are now free to leave the plantation whenever you want, Mr. Smith said. However, since we are surrounded by other plantations, if you leave, some other plantation owner will likely claim you as his own the moment you set foot on his property. So I urge you not to risk your newfound freedom by doing something so foolish.
I think there are those of us who go out of our way to seek truth, even if it's weird, even if it's outside of our paradigm, even if it's stuff that most people don't think about. The thing is, the world changes when there's that small minority of weird people that think about that stuff, and then they go, this is important, and they, stand on a soapbox and scream it for a few hundred years, and eventually the rest of the population falls along. Like abolitionists saying slavery is really bad, they were a minority of the population, and now we all know that slavery is bad, including the stupid people who never would have figured it out on their own. They would have just gone along with it. Like, the difference between most people today and most people pre-slavery is only when they were born. It's not that they actually figured it out on their own. So that weird aberration of the population that likes to question things, that's the only thing that ever moves society and humanity forward. So the fact that we may be this weird tiny minority does not mean we can't move the whole herd. Kind of hate to use that word, but it's kind of like a herd. Doesn't mean we can't move the whole herd to a point where we realize violent domination is not okay no matter what you call it. And I would make a distinction, like people, there's a whole lot of terms that people have very vague ideas about what they mean, and democracy is definitely one of them. When it comes to democracy, the closest thing to that that's actually legitimate and useful and moral is consensus. If there's a bunch of us and we're like, hey, what should we do? Does everybody want to do such and such? And we all go, yeah, fine. That's consensus. That's moral. That's voluntary for everybody. And some people would call that democracy. If there's 10 of us saying, what do we want to order for lunch? And 8 of us say, let's get pizza. And 2 of us say, we're vegan. And the 8 of us say, you're going to pay for pizza because the majority has decided. That is immoral. That is democracy. And that is how the political system works. It's a majority forcing their will on a minority. That's not okay. And the thing is, the propaganda we're fed about democracy intentionally muddles the distinction. So it's like, well, this is the will of the people and this is what we want. Well, this might be what some of us want, and it's what some of us are being forced to go along with against our will. That's not okay. The majority doesn't have a right to violently dominate a minority. And when I'm trying to be like sensationalist and offend people, I say the perfect example of direct democracy in action is gang rape. And it's not freaking okay. It doesn't matter that the majority decided to do that to the minority. The minority is supreme. The individual owns himself. And that perfectly allows for a consensus and people getting along and figuring out ways to do things. It does not allow for the sacrifice of the individual in the name of the common good. And the term for that is collectivism. That's the basis of communism. It's the basis of fascism. It's the basis of every one of the most famous nasty tyrants in history. They all said, it's okay to sacrifice the rights of the individual if it's for the common good. Mao said it, Stalin said it, Hitler said it. That was the common theme of all the tyrants. And voluntarists say, it's never okay to sacrifice the individual. The individual owns himself. Now, the majority can go do something on their own. You just don't get to drag the minority into it. You don't get to force them to fund it. You don't get to force them to go along with it. They own themselves. You either leave them alone or they voluntarily go along with the program. But the common good has been the biggest excuse for the worst evils in history. It's really a matter of getting people to recognize that what they instinctively understand about right and wrong and how people should be and how society should be doesn't match what they've been taught about authority and government and law and those things. Basically, they've been indoctrinated into the notion that this beast called government is necessary and it's legitimate and it's representing us and we are the government and all this weird mythology that we're taught that isn't even remotely close to being true. And pretty much everything I do, all the projects I work on, my books and videos and everything else, is about trying to get people to see you already have inside you all the wisdom and morality you need. This isn't like a world full of evil people. Yeah, there are some nasty sociopaths, but it's not a majority, it's not most of us, but most of us have been taught things that actually make us betray what we really know about how people should be. If you ask somebody, is it okay to beat up your neighbor and take his stuff? Well, no, of course not. Is it okay to vote for a government who will tax your neighbor to fund for the common good? Well, yeah. No, it isn't. You're describing the same thing in different words. And so what I do is try to make people realize they already know all they need to know to dismiss government as an inherently immoral beast, but they have to look carefully at what they really believe in versus what they've been taught by way of this political mythology, which is literally making millions and millions of good people betray themselves and accidentally become advocates of mass violence and evil without recognizing it as such.
What's the origin of it? Is it nefarious origin, or is it just a manifestation of human fear?
I think it's absolutely calculated and intentional. I mean, you can say that we're sort of, we're genetically predisposed to go into groups, and there's sort of the alpha thing of, a bunch of people may go, well, I want a leader, I don't want it to be on my shoulders. And so that much of it you can sort of blame it on genetics and stuff. But along the way, certain individuals, and this, started many thousands of years ago, way before we have what we have now, figured out there are ways to manipulate and trick other people to make them serve me against their will. It may be I'm gonna, if I can do something that other people can't understand, and then I can say, well, the gods talk to me, and I can give you favors if you give me money to give to God, which, curiously, none of it ever makes it to God. But if you give me some favors, I'll help you out. And then it just sort of evolves into, if there's some way I can trick you into thinking that you have to obey me, you're morally obligated to, and eventually you have divine right of kings. Well, God told me I get to be your king. And we're not quite dumb enough to fall for that anymore. But the divine right of politicians is just a more elaborate excuse for the same insanity and the notion that, well, we need these people to violently dominate us and rob us, because otherwise there would be chaos. When people start to understand what authority is and what it does to people, and my book, The Most Dangerous Superstition, is about the belief in authority, and part of it is what it does to people. What the belief in authority does to most people is it makes them basically betray their own conscience in favor of obedience to a bunch of crooks. What it does to the people who imagine themselves to be authority, whether you're talking about cops who are just, well, I'm just an agent of the law, or the politicians, it makes them into immoral jerks, and it can't not. Now, the problem is people who are already immoral, crooked jerks are first in line for that position, because the people who love to dominate and control others, if you make a job description, come be a politician and violently dominate and rob everybody else, who do you think's going to show up for that job? And the ones who win it are the ones who can pretend to be compassionate and caring. You can't get the job by saying, I just like beating people up and taking their stuff. But if you know how to spin it I care about you and it's for the common good, and again, all the tyrants did this, the same propaganda, then all the good people thinking that, well, we need a government, they fall for it, and literally you have masses of otherwise good people empowering the worst people in the world. And if you look at, the videos of Hitler and his adoring throngs, these happy, enthusiastic, cheerful people cheering for him. Same thing with Mao, same thing with Stalin. It's not because those people were getting up and saying, I want to do evil stuff, and a bunch of evil people were going, rah, 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 do evil stuff. They were saying, I'm going to save the country. I'm going to make Germany great again. I'm going to, whatever it is, I'm going to fight against some injustice if you just give me power over you. And so the belief in government takes the power and the energy and the enthusiasm and the goodness of the general public and turns that into fuel for evil. You know, it may sound dramatic, but if you open a history book, that's what actually happens. Good people fund evil. It is the law-abiding taxpayers of every one of those nasty regimes that made those nasty regimes possible. So the evil psycho at the top, yeah, he's a bad guy, he's a problem. He's only a problem because all the other people believe in authority. Because otherwise he's one ranting psycho in a corner and who cares what he thinks. The good people who get tricked by that are the ones who act as enforcers, or they're funding it, or they're going along with it, or they're advocating it, or they're condemning anybody who goes against it. And that's why it's so heinous, but it's also why there's so much hope. If it was just a world of evil people, I'd be like, well, I'm just going to run and hide in a cabin somewhere. But it's a world of good, duped people, and they can be unduped, so they stop accidentally advocating things that don't even match what they really want.